Hi there, this is the second and final part of the Joseph jogger sew along. So in the last part I covered applying the pockets and also the knee patches, and I was trying to emphasise really that the knee patches can be purely functional, or you can use them for more decorative embellishment, so play around with contrast colours and stitching, things like that. So in this video we're just basically going to finish the garment now. So I'm going to sew the rest of the joggers together using an overlocker. It's really the quickest and easiest method to sew them together. But if you haven't got an overlocker, that's absolutely fine. You can just use a regular sewing machine. You just need to make sure it's threaded with a jersey or ballpoint needle, and then turn your stitch to a shallow zigzag or a stretch stitch. So the first thing we're going to do, we've got our prepared front leg panels. And I'm just putting right sides together, and I'm going to stitch them down the front rise seam. So the seam allowance on this pattern is 1 centimetre. So as far as the overlock is concerned, I'm just going to cut off a tiny little bit to bring the seam to the right size. But if you're obviously working on a sewing machine, you just need to make sure your seam is lined up with the 1 centimetre grid. So let's go ahead and stitch that. There we go. It's best to also just run a test before you start sewing, just to make sure your stitching is right. So the next thing I'm going to do is the same with the centre back seam, centre back rise seam. So I'm just putting right sides together, and I'm going to go ahead and stitch that. So I'm not pinning or clipping this together because it's quite a short distance, and I feel quite confident, but you know, you can pin this or clip it. I tend to stick to clips only with the overlocker if that's your method of sewing together. There we have that seam. So now you should have a back piece joined together and your front piece is joined together. So the next thing to do is to join the front and back together at the side seams and also at the inside legs. But just before we do that, we just need to bring this pocket into position so it's easier to stitch. So if you push the pocket bag behind the trouser leg and just line up the top, the pocket bag, the pocket back and the front along the waist edge and also down the side seam edge, and just clip those together. I do recommend just taking this to a flat surface before you actually stitch this together, just to check there's no sort of cockles or it's lying nice and flat. But basically that's what we want on the front and on the back, so it's all lying nice and flat. And then you can just machine tack or tack by hand these edges together, and it's ready then to just sew to the back. So I'm going to go ahead and just check this lying it flat before I sew it, and then I'm just going to machine tack those in place, and then I'll come back and show you how that looks. So I've stitched those with a long machine tacking stitch, and actually when I took this to the ironing board and pressed it, I did find that the pocket bags had moved a little bit, so I found that putting pins in the middle will just help line it up and keep it flat and push that excess out to the sides so that the pocket is lying nice and flat. And that often happens when you're working like this, sort of, rather than working on a flat surface. But it's always best just to double check all these things. So that's stitched. I've stitched within the seam allowance, so essentially I'll probably cut some of that off as I go because it's just a functional tacking stitch. But I'm ready to pin or clip the sides and the inside leg together now. So I'm going to remove these pins that we used to stabilise the pocket. And now I'm going to clip the back piece along the side seams. There we go, right sides together. So I'll be clipping that for a few minutes and then we'll go ahead and stitch that. So there we go, they're all clipped. As far as the inside seam is concerned, I started off with matching the centre back and centre front rise seams and then pinned out or clipped out from there, making sure that they're matching at the end because your fabric can move along a little bit, but they're all nicely matching up. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch that now. So I'll show you how that looks in a minute. So there we go, all stitched together. So I'm going to just turn these through and I'll show you the next stage. So there we go, looking pretty good. So the next step is to make the waistband and the hembands, and then we're pretty much there. So let's start with the waistband. So the first thing to do is just to fold the waistband in half so the short ends are matched with right sides together, and stitch across the short end. And while I'm there, I'm also going to prepare the hem bands as well. So again, right sides together and bring the short ends together and just stitch down here. Go. So now we can bring this together to make the waistband. So we're going to fold wrong sides together and bring raw edges together, and I'm just going to go and press this so that it's a neat waistband. So but basically you've just got the raw edges together, you've got a folded edge, and we're going to apply this waistband as one whole piece with both edges. So I'm just going to press that and then I'll show you the next part. So I have gone ahead and pressed that edge. It just makes it a little bit more easy to manage and a bit more easy for me to show you. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use the seam as the centre back seam, and I'm just going to fold that and put a small nick in the opposite edge. So this will become the centre front seam, so I can match that to that point on the joggers. So now I'm going to start by putting those marks to the appropriate places on the joggers. So centre back seam to centre back seam on the joggers, and just clip that in place. And then also clip the front. The waistband should fit exactly, but just in case there's any sort of discrepancies, it's better just to mark your centres and work from there. So those 2 points are now clipped. So I'm going to carry on and just clip the whole waistband around the edge of the top edge of the joggers, and I'll show you how that looks in a minute. That's fitted really nicely all the way around. So now I'm going to stitch all 3 layers together, but what I need to do is just leave a little gap to insert the elastic. So I recommend don't leave the gap on a seam because it becomes bulky with lots of layers of joining up and things. So I tend to go somewhere near the centre back seam, but you know, a couple of centimetres, well about 3 or 4 centimetres away from that seam, and then just come off leaving a gap of around about the same. So I'm going to go ahead and sew that, and I'll show you how that looks. So there we go, I've left a little gap here. And what I should say on the pattern is there is also a version with 2 little buttonholes if you want to do a draw cord around the waist. and top stitching. And also I have actually done this the opposite way on the pattern, because the next stage is done first on the pattern, which is probably a better way to do it really. But what I'm going to do now is just stitch a row of stitching around the waist using a regular sewing machine with a zigzag stitch, just so that you've got a nice strong seam at the waist. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch this. The reason why it's better to do it, stitch it first and then overlock it second, is that it's important to make sure your channel here is the right depth for the elastic. So there isn't a huge amount of room in there for your elastic to move, because it needs to be quite nice and snugly fitting. So it's just being careful really to make sure your distance here is right. So there we go, I've stitched that seam. So what I've done is just stitch directly below the overlocking, but like I said, it's best really to stitch then overlock afterwards. But you've got a nice reinforced waist seam there. What I did was I used a shallow long zigzag stitch just so that the seam has a bit of flexibility. So the next thing to do is to insert the elastic. So I've pre-cut the elastic to fit my son's waist and threaded the end with a safety pin. So now all we need to do is just to insert the elastic around the channel. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and I'll show you how that looks in a minute. So I've got the two ends of elastic have come out of the channel. I've taken the pin off. So all we need to do now is just lay one on top of the other and just sew that together. You can just sew that together with a regular sewing machine, and you can't do that on the overlocker. It needs to be nice and flat. But before you sew it, just check that your elastic in the channel hasn't twisted, so that when you lay one on top of the other it's not twisted over, otherwise you'll have a twisted waist elastic in the waist channel. So I've just checked that, and I'm just going to go ahead and sew that, and then I'll show you the next stage. So there we go, I've stitched just a simple square. It doesn't really matter what it looks like as long as it's strong. So I had to pull the elastic out a little bit just to get that onto the machine. So now I'm just going to pull the elastic so that it sinks inside the waistband, and we just need to close that little hole up. So I'm going to just go and stitch the hole closed with the machine first, and then I'm just going to overlock, just go a little bit past the end so that you make a neat finish, and then I'll show you putting the cuffs on the hem and the last finishing touch on the waistband. So there we go, I've gone ahead and closed the gap. I've stitched it closed first on the machine, and then I've overlocked it closed. So I've just gone a little bit past where I started to make sure I can try and get a smooth line there really. And then the last thing to do on the waist is just to pull the waist so the elastic sits evenly around the channel. And then on this pair I've just stitched down and then reversed back to hold the elastic at the side seams on both sides. But like I said, the pattern does also include instructions how to do a bit more of a feature waistband with the buttonholes and a draw cord, and then that has 2 rows of decorative stitching where the draw cord sits. But you could also do that without the draw cord, so you could stitch around the whole waist, especially if you wanted to tie in with your decorative stitching on the knees. And all that involves really is just slightly pulling the waist into a flat line as you stitch, and using a shallow zigzag stitch again as you stitch, and then that completes the waistband. So now the final thing to do is to put the hemband cuffs on. So we made those up earlier, and so you should have pieces like this. So now we just need to fold this in half, so we've got wrong sides going together to form the cuff. So bring your raw edges together like this, and there's your cuff. Because this is quite a small area, I don't tend to quarter the cuffs, I just mark the halfway point. So So we've got one seam, so if you just fold the cuff so that you can mark the other edge, and that will be your halfway seam. So you've got the seam and your other halfway mark marked, and then we just need to do the same on the leg piece. What you will find is the back leg is slightly wider than the front leg, so I would go from the inside leg seam, using that as your seam, the one that you'll match up with your seam on your cuff, and then just lay it flat to make, it's only about 1 centimetre, but it's just enough to make it uneven if you don't match it to the half. So just mark half from that inside seam there. You can just see it's just over a little bit, and then turn your leg back through to the other side. I'm just going to trim off some of these loose ends, and then put your cuff, let's just check I got that right, so the seam to the inside leg seam, and mark that, and then your notch on your cuff to the notch on the trouser leg, and mark that. So you will find that there is a little bit of slack there, but it's not very much, but the trouser is a little bit bigger than the cuff, and that's how it should be. So now if you're feeling confident, you can just take that to the machine and sew it. If you feel like it might still be a little bit too tricky, you can tack this round, but I'd recommend hand tacking it in place. But you need to really stretch the cuff to fit the leg as you go, but that will hold it better for when you're ready to overlock. But I'm going to go ahead and overlock this. So I'm going to start near the seam but not on the seam, and just go all the way around, and like I said, pulling the cuff as I stitch. I'm going to stitch on the cuff, but with the cuff uppermost from the inside like this. I'll show you how that looks in a second. There we go. So it's, like I said, it's a very little bit, but you just still want to get it evenly dispersed really. And what I've done is just stitched over the end and just kept going a little bit just to taper that off. And then this end part you can either thread back into the stitching, or you can probably just snip that off because it's not usually going anywhere. And that is the end of making the garment. So we just need to trim up a few loose threads and things. So there we go, all finished. Nice simple jogging bottom pattern for kids, and a great wardrobe staple too. So please feel free to ask any further questions or leave comments, and I hope you enjoyed that video. I am posting videos regularly now every Friday, so if you'd like to see some more, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you.